Okay, David.
Okay, well,
This is the final bit. I mean, I want to say that all these stories and loads more are in your book that you've got in your hand there. A
yes,
Head Full of Jolly Robins, subtitled "This Man Is No Class," which is a bit self-depreciating.
well,
I thoroughly enjoyed it, and it's written largely in memory of your late
well,
wife Marjorie, who
yeah,
suffered from motor neurone disease.
yeah, suffered sadly motor neurone, and I, I've bought this book, and I'm just giving it to friends and families and people at the races who are interested, in return for a donation to the motor neurone disease. And well, around about the 80s, when Frank O'Sullivan was on the scene, he sent a horse over to Cheltenham called King Ragapan, and it ran in the novice hurdle. It was leading till 2 out, and then it finished down the pack. But he left it over here with David Ellsworth, and then it let him down at Plumpton, and he couldn't trust the thing, so he said, "Give me £1,000 for him." So I gave him £1,000 for it and sent him to a Pat Taylor at Lambourne, an old friend of ours, a trainer who was very good with horses. And well, I better cut a long story short. It finished second. It finished fourth when it was favourite at Bangor, and the track didn't suit it there. And then Ron Atkins, who was just starting training, offered me £2,000 for it. And quite frankly, I was spending more on the horse than I was on myself, so I accepted that. He and Dennis Mackay, between them, managed to lame the horse in a race at Kempton on firm ground where it shouldn't have run. So that was my one venture into owning racehorses. But at that time, Neil had got me into returning starting prices. In fact, this book should have been called Parallel Lines. My life in the racing and the sporting field, and my life at the academic field. But unfortunately, Blondie has an LP out called Parallel Lines, and they wouldn't let me have the title. So that's the origin of the title, is A Head Full of Jolly Robins, from my old grandmother during the wartime when she had to look after me. She could never find me because always hiding and playing tricks. And she'd go out to the street and tell her friends, "Yon lad there, he's got a head full of jolly robins." So with a publisher like that title. The other title there is comes from an episode in Tampa where Marjorie and I were staying with Peter Anderson, who was playing for Tampa Bay Rowdies with Rodney Marsh at the time. And we'd gone off to training. I'd gone off with him to training. We dropped her off at the university library. The idea was we'd pick her up at 1:30 after training. We'd go and have lunch. Well, about 12:30, the heavens opened. There was a real tornado and, well, hurricane, and we were all stuck on the motorways. We couldn't move. She was stuck at the library waiting for me, and she knew what had happened, but it was 2 hours before we got to her, by which time she'd been walking around there, and this chap had been chatting her up and idling her and so on, and eventually he said, "Madam, can I assist you in any way?" She says, "No." She says, "I'm waiting for my husband." And he just looked at her and shook his head and said, "The man has no class." So that's the origin, the other title that they might have used. So I'd started then to write columns for at the time it was the Sporting Chronicle Handicap Book, and Len Bell was the editor, and I've been writing little bits about gambling when any little stories appeared, I'd send them into the handicap book, and he just said to me, well, next Tuesday, he said, if you've got something, ring me at 2 o'clock. So I had a couple of stories, one about Richard Hannon, and every time he wore a red check shirt, he was having it off. And
Back in winners, that is.
Well, training winners,
Yeah,
actually.
training
Richard Hannon
winners.
Senior, this was. And and the other one was about Michael Stout being dragged round the parade ring at Kempton by a horse called Truly Brave, which was 7-4 on favourite and didn't run. And then Rule 4 came into operation and really was not suitable for the case because the deductions were not enough for probably about 6-4 on. And so I put together 2 or 3 little articles, and he said, oh, at about 3 o'clock they'd taken this down, and he said, right, same time next Tuesday. And from then on, I was writing the column, Smalley's People, for the handicap book, because
I remember I used to read it when I first got into racing. Yeah.
You'd
I
learn
was 19 in
that.
1984. Yeah, that was.
Well, it was about. I think it was about 86 when I started. I'd put 1 or 2 bits and pieces in before, but so I'd started to write this column, and well, you know, it didn't, like yourself, there were several people. I tried to make them something about betting, but also about people. And occasionally I got my bum bitten, you might say. Alan of H&S at the track always used to put me right on 1 or 2 things.
Alan Marcel.
Alan Marcel,
Yeah.
yeah.
Now, there's a few things I want to bring up.
Right.
Everybody's heard about Gary Wiltshire doing his cobblers.
Yes.
But you actually laid Fujiyama Crest as well. You laid.
Oh, I laid Fujiyama Crest. Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. I was actually standing with John Reed, John Reed's brother Noel. John was riding in the race, and I was, you know, and he'd ridden 6, and we were all waiting for him, the jockeys, to come out, and John came out, and he whispered to Noel on the way out, he'll need a supercharger to win this. And so I thought, well, yeah, he can't win this. And the horse was a 14-1 chance in the morning, and by this time it's 7-2. And then it's coming down, money's coming in from everywhere, off the track, on the track. The bookies, like Gary Wiltshire, were taking money, but they didn't have enough to pay out. Well, I was quite friendly with John Turner. He was always cooperative. When I was an SP man, he'd always tell me the price for money, and so I got the idea that, well, it can't win. I can lay something at 5-2 that should be 12-1. So I laid him a 500-2, because he said, I'll take it because I don't have enough to pay. If it, you know, he said, I'll need the cash. Well, of course it came in. I wasn't carrying 500 with me at the time, but next day at Ascot, I duly handed over the 500 quid. And I was talking to Terry Ellis, who was Pat Edery's driver and manager and brother-in-law. And he said Pat was riding 1 of 2 for Henry Cecil. And it was like 5-2 favourite, and the other one was 7 or 8-1. And so I said, well, Terry, what's the form? He says, I don't know. He said, I'm beginning to think we're on the wrong horse. And he backed the favourite. And he says, and then he said, swore, and then said, he said, we're on the wrong horse. So the other horse was 7 or 8-1. So I had a 5-70.
Now with the fractions, good man.
With the fractions. I had a 5 to 70, the other one, which duly won and got me back my 500 quid and taught me one of the biggest lessons.
Now that brings me nicely on to a very sad tale. Everybody thinks that bookmakers always win. Wayne Heathcote. They used to use Too Fearless, a bookmaker, and this is Australian.
Oh, yes, of course. That was, what was he called? Wayne Heathcote.
Wayne Heathcote, yeah.
Well, Wayne, yeah, he was a big African art dealer. He was quite wealthy. He's still around. He lives in Oxford and he's still dealing. But he took on the bookmakers with just a clerk and a runner. And he would take and he wasn't really betting by form. He was betting by hunches. And he would take quite some big bets, and I heard he was dealing a bit with Tabor at one time, and then suddenly he wasn't appearing at the track, and it turned out that he laid Tabor to lose 100 grand, so the story goes, but I got it from Wayne Heathcote's stepbrother, who was actually a clerk for Ward Hill on the rails, and he'd laid Monsieur to lose the Arc, to lose 100 grand, and that knocked him out of the ring really, and he never really appeared again. So that story came via his brother, who is now a trainer in Brisbane. And Wayne and what's he called? I've been to the stable 3 or 4 times. Forgotten his brother's name. They went to Australia. They've been brought up in New Zealand and Australia, and they'd come over here, and the brother had married a lass from Acton. They went back to Brisbane, and when I was in Brisbane, I went to the yard at Eagle Farm, Doomben, a flea-bitten yard, and it was a horrible place, really. But he had a couple of good horses, and he'd supposed to set one up for Wayne that was supposed to win and didn't. And so Wayne and he parted ways. He had to mortgage his house so that he could carry on training. But 6 years later, when I went round there, he was right back in the big time, and he eventually won the big sprint at Alquoz with a horse that he'd been training as a miler, and came out and won as a 6 furlong horse at Meydan. Now, he's still training. He was top trainer in Queensland, but he did have a heart problem, and I think he's a joint trainer at the last count. I tried to see him, but I couldn't see him the last time I was there. But he'd done very well, but from being a pencil man with Ward Hill, he was a good cricketer, and we had finished up playing cricket with him down at Hampshire. Neil Wilkins had got a press team together, and it was a nice story. He sort of gone rock bottom, but pulled himself up by his bootstraps.
But there's plenty of really good stories in that book. Can you hold it up again, David?
Yeah.
So if anybody wants this one, can they collar you at the race course?
They could collar me, yes, as long as they know me, and they will contribute to motor neuron. I've got about 40 copies left. I can't carry them all around with me, but I've usually got 3 or 4 in the back of the car. So if anybody's interested, then I'm only glad to. As long as they know me.
Yeah.
I haven't said much about Marjorie, but
you want to say something about Marjorie?
well, yes. In fact, she introduced me to racing in one sense, because I used to play cricket, and she hated cricket, but it was the only game I was really any good at. So to stop me when we were first married, going off at weekends and playing cricket, she bought me memberships to Ascot, Kempton and Windsor for Christmas, so that then I'd be more inclined to take her to the races and those at the time when the racing was on, and that's how it all started. And the only other thing too, there's a nice story about William Buick that I've known since he was 10. Walter, his father, was a jockey here, as you may know, but he was Van Cutsum and was middle of the road. So he went to Scandinavia and became leading jockey for 12, 13 years in Scandinavia. Married a Swedish lass who was a jockey, brought up three young boys. The eldest one used to come up when Walter finished riding and training, for which he was not getting paid. He used to come over here, and Jets found him a job with the Press Association, and he used to bring William with him to the races, and a few of the old fuddy-duddies didn't like kids in the racing room, so I used to, when I wasn't working, I'd take over and we'd go around the racetrack, and I'd learn more from William than I'd ever found out from anyone else. He perhaps learned a bit from me in the betting ring, not that he does, but anyway, I've known him since he was 10, and when he used to go to Todd Pletcher's over the winter in America and ride out for Todd Pletcher and a former top jockey called Angel Cordera. And this top jockey he wouldn't let William out of his sight. He wanted him over there as a bug apprentice, him as the agent, and he said, we will really make some money. But Walter insisted he came back here. I used to meet him over in Florida at the races. He'd come down with Pletcher's horses and take him copies of the racing, bundles of racing posts. And then when he came back here, we became quite friends. I don't ask for tips. We don't communicate on betting. And when he met my wife many times, and they were very friendly. And when Marjorie was diagnosed with motor neurone, I was at Ascot one day, and he was asking how she was, and I said, well, I'm afraid it's not good. He said, well, look, he said, any money you need for an operation, any money you need for treatment, he said, just let me know and you can have it from me. Which was, and there's no cure for there are supposedly cures in Mexico, but they never work, and there were no cures, but he insisted that he would pay for the treatment if we could find any. So I thought that was a great gesture from a young lad who was maybe 23, 24, to make such a gesture. And yeah, I know he's got a bit of a devil in him at times, but he's a great lad. He's a lovely lad. Champion jockey, and it's an honour for the sport.
Brilliant. Well, David, you can tell it's making you emotional there.
Well, a little bit, because yeah, he's just got two boys of his own now. He just had another baby. One of his lads is called David.
Well, on that note, David, it's been a pleasure talking to you. Thank you very much.
Oh, you're welcome, Simon.